Hello, and welcome to Your Art Sucks, a podcast that aims to destroy mediocrity in all forms of art. And this is episode 6, Being Hated, Ernest Hemingway and Maya Lin. In this episode, we will look at the raw emotion of hate and how it applies to artists and their work. By looking at these two artists, we will see if hate can derail a career, or does hate allow the artist total freedom to produce work that draws so much negativity it actually thrives? Hopefully, at the end of this episode, we will have some perspective on hate and the damage that it can do. So let's get to it. Before we get into the show, I did want to bring up the impetus for this episode. In the last episode, Publicity Stunted, I spoke about Sinead O'Connor and the Sex Pistols and how their planned actions caused the public to react with anger. I went further to talk about how Sinead's career spiraled down with the weight of the public's hate bearing down directly on her shoulders. But the Pistols, on the other hand, used hate as a means to disrupt society and force people to look at the filth and hopelessness that was 1970s UK. So that episode got me thinking about the impact of hate on art and the artist. While both Sinead and the Pistols were in the spotlight decades ago, we know that hate is not defined to any single generation. Unfortunately, this negative emotion has become far more prevalent of late with the rise of social media. It has grown to the point that, ironically, some have come to consider the act of trolling to have been elevated to an art form. In the eyes of most haters, a well-placed teardown of someone's work can lead to hundreds of thousands of likes. Hell, people have made a career out of hating others and their artwork. Look at YouTube, and you'll see personalities with thousands of subscribers who do nothing but rain hate on others and their work. Such behavior is certainly nothing new, but they've become more powerful with the supreme ease to which communication can be instantaneously spread. More troubling is that these derisionists are far more entrenched in the psyche of the public, as they are impossible to bury from your feed. You may block or mute haters, but the hate continues unabated, with or without your involvement. They are a ceaseless source of consternation. Now, back in the day, a bad review in a newspaper may be detrimental, but the impact was always limited to the regionality of the publication. Certainly larger publications came with an elevated risk that a single piece could possibly be career-ending. But I'm far more inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to the critics these magazines employed. First, these professionals were career-minded individuals. They honed their skills from a background of intimate knowledge of the medium, and they had a deep interest in the future of the craft. They cared how the medium was moved. Now, don't get me wrong, some critics definitely stood in the way of artists and certain movements that they didn't fully understand. But to their credit, their columns and reviews have brought more artists and their art to the forefront of the buying public than those they've wounded by their words. Today, we can't say this is the case. The raw truth is that any idiot with a Wi-Fi signal can slap together tweets or grams or posts that attempt to provide the illusion of educated insight, but are nothing more than clickbait. They are normally one-dimensional, lowly opinions that, at worst, border on verbal masturbation. Now, haters, unlike critics, only care for the short-term gain, with no concern over consequence or investment in the future of the medium. In all honesty, their goal is myopic. They only post to destroy. Art will never be bettered by their abuse, and artists may avoid the spotlight to escape the impact of their vitriol. Now, artists can contribute to this hatred as well. We'll see a little bit of that in this episode. An artist doesn't work in a vacuum, and they must be aware that their actions have an impact on the artistic community as a whole. Artists who arrogantly promote shitty work for spectacle alone add to a narrative that is single in its angered focus. All artists suffer when their discipline is taken hostage by the lowest common denominator of self-promoted artists who feel their work signals the next wave of originality. In their vanity, they only come to crave attention, good or bad, to further a narrative that pulls away from truly talented artists. Sadly, the general public fails to recognize the difference. Hate, no matter the basis, seems to garner itself its own version of the truth by way of public approval, true talent gets lost in the fog of tweet wars. Now, taking public hate for the actions of a talentless hack, well, that's one thing. But the worst type of hate an artist can face is the jealous hate of their peers. Worse would actually be to draw lethal criticism from an artist you admire. Now, that could really hit us deep in our creative bones, maybe even scar us. In my experience, authors are the worst group to malign or be maligned by. They live and die by their chosen words. For them, it's not enough to wound your combatant, you must always go for the throat. And with words as their knives, they rarely miss the mark. So, for some fun, how about we look at some scathing insults great writers have said about other great writers? I just want to point out something interesting here. These insults were originally handwritten or typed, and they were barely known outside of those who actually read these letters or were provided this information. There was no thought that they would be spread to millions upon millions in later years. So, artists, I warn you, when you speak of others, choose your words wisely, as they will become permanently etched in the concrete of the superinformation highway. Okay, here are some legends dissing their counterparts. First, let's look at Mark Twain's disdain of Jane Austen. He says, "Her books madden me so that I can't conceal my frenzy from the reader. And therefore I have to stop every time I begin. Every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig her up and hit her over the skull with her own shin bone." It's kind of dark. Or how about we go to George Bernard Shaw and his criticism of William Shakespeare? It also has some similar grave undertones. He says, "The intensity and impatience with him," obviously meaning Shakespeare, "occasionally reaches such a pitch that it would be positively a relief to me to dig him up and throw stones at him." I don't know what's going on with these guys, but digging up dead people just to abuse them seems kind of weird. And here's one between Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway, who is also the focus of our episode. Faulkner stated, "Hemingway has never been known to use a word that might send a reader to the dictionary." And Hemingway offered a retort, responding with, "Poor Faulkner. Does he really think big emotions come from big words?" Now, continuing with Hemingway, one can say that outside of Faulkner, there were a lot of artists that Hemingway just didn't care for. For anyone who has some knowledge of his life, we know that he was quite open about his feelings towards others. In fact, he liked pushing his superiority in other writers' faces to provoke them to react. Yeah, he could be a real asshole when the mood struck. And unfortunately, it struck quite often. And this leads us to how Hemingway had hate play into his career. Now, I think it needs mentioning that the hate that existed in Hemingway's life wasn't due to his work. His books are some of the most critically acclaimed and highly respected novels produced by an American writer. In fact, in 1956, he was even awarded a Nobel Prize for Literature. He joined the ranks of greats like George Bernard Shaw, Yeats, Churchill, and oddly enough, William Faulkner. Earnest's works like The Sun Also Rises and A Movable Feast, they defined a lost generation, and they fueled countless writers to follow suit in dropping everything and moving to Paris. I mean, you'd have a hard time finding an aspiring writer who hasn't been influenced by Hemingway's succinct prose. Now you get the point. For many, Hemingway is a literary god. But while his talent was never in doubt, his personal life was filled with conflict, alcohol, and tragedy, most of which is self-imposed. Earnest, in my eyes, suffered from a superiority complex. He had an incessant need to dominate men who crossed his path. Was this to make up for some perceived internal weakness? I can't say. But Hemingway drew a great amount of hate with his imposed hierarchy. He pissed a lot of men off on purpose. I mean, he wanted to agitate them to the point of physical conflict, which he relished in. Take, for instance, when Hemingway slapped critic Max Eastman in the face with a book and demanded he fight him. But this altercation could also be traced back to when Eastman, who was 10 years Ernest's senior, managed to toss Earnest over a desk after a heated exchange. Now, Hemingway denied that this ever happened, but I think His actions of attacking Eastman in front of a room full of people shows that there was some underlying heated exchange between the two. There was definitely a history there, and I think Hemingway wanted to have the last attack on him. Now, there's other examples of this aggression. We could look to his many nights where Hemingway drank with James Joyce, another famous author. The two were quite a pair, and it seems James Joyce would deliberately pick fights with people at the bar just to have Hemingway assault them. I mean, Hemingway's he was an amateur boxer, and these skills, they came into play in these bar fights. Now, to continue with the theme of, Hemingway being a jerk, we can also point to the bullying behavior he showed F. Scott Fitzgerald, who tried to confide in him about the concerns he had over the size of his manhood. See, Fitzgerald's wife kind of made a comment to Hemingway that, F. Scott didn't have the size of tool enough to satisfy her. So when F. Scott Fitzgerald came to Hemingway with this concern, Hemingway, he feigned that he cared. He kind of consoled him, but nonetheless, he wrote about the entire incident in one of his books. I mean, nothing like sharing the intimate details with the world. So Hemingway was, for lack of a better word, kind of a real dick. But some of you may say, well, so what? Some men hated him. Is that all? I mean, because all of what I said so far seems pretty minor. Well, no. There's more. He was also a known misogynist. He made claims that it would be easier to shoot a woman dead than to break up with her. Now, some may claim that what he was saying was done in jest, but the sentiment is clear. Earnest had issues with his mother. He blamed her for her overbearing nature, and he says that's what eventually led his father to commit suicide. I mean, the truth is Hemingway did have some deep and meaningful relationships, but they were always set against the dynamic that he was the center of attention. And to prove this, look at his relationship with Martha Gellhorn. He loved her, and they had a great relationship until she started to become more successful than him. And their union was doomed from that point forward. Now, we could go on to discuss his disdain for homosexuality, his associations with known anti-Semites like Ezra Pound, or his incessant need to kill animals only to prop up his thin masculinity. Yeah, he existed in a different time, and maybe those things at that time were somewhat accepted. But they still angered a lot of people, and they still do to this day. I mean, you can't go into a single writer's forum and mention Hemingway and how great he is, and then somebody will instantly counter you with his numerous antisocial habits. He's a contentious author, to be sure. Well, we can surely see that hate was an aspect to his life. It actually failed to impact his work. He made his detractors eat their words, and he did so with a great amount of pride. He also never failed to return a criticism with a punch in the face. But hate did do Earnest in the end. One could easily see that his own hatred of losing that macho image in the public eye, due to his failing health, was one he couldn't have. He couldn't allow his critics to stalk him like the prey that he used to stalk. Now, he, for one, was not going to be like the old lion trying in vain to protect his own pride. So, he committed suicide. Now, as we leave that violent end, we move to another period in history where violence claimed thousands of soldiers' lives. It was the Vietnam War. And in 1979, a Vietnam vet named Jan Scruggs, he was instrumental in starting the process to have a memorial created to honor the veterans of this terrible conflict. We do have to note that this was a war that was extremely unpopular in the 60s. I mean, it was an absolutely terrible conflict, and it divided U.S. society at the time. Some soldiers returning from the war, just glad to be alive, they faced hatred and mental stresses that impacted their lives for decades after the conflict. So, to have a monument erected to a very troubling point in American history was obviously controversial. But in 1980, Congress allotted 3 acres in the National Mall. Now, the National Mall it's a grassy area stretching from the U.S. Capitol building all the way to the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And Jan's nonprofit group was able to generate the funds necessary to have a monument built. The next phase was to hold a contest, and it was open to anyone to submit their designs for such a memorial. Now, these submissions would be reviewed by a committee, and they wanted to make sure that any monument that was erected would bring attention to the deceased soldiers as well as help those that survived to heal. They wanted the memorial to be absent of any political messages and to be a place of contemplation and reflection. Now, out of 1,500 entries, the committee was unanimous in its selection of artist Maya Lin. Lin's design broke with tradition through its use of black granite polished to a reflective smoothness, instead of the normal white limestone or marble we normally see. It also was poised horizontally, and it was submerged into the earth instead of rising vertically. And its lack of any figurative ornamentation or embellishment at all, save for the chronological listing of names of soldiers killed in the course of the war, added to its very non-traditional stance. This design was unlike anything seen prior in the US. It was minimalist, and in some ways it was utilitarian. So here's where the hate became realized. The design sparked instant remarks from veterans, politicians, critics, and the general public. They called the design the Black Gash of Shame. They also said it was a monument to defeat, a degrading ditch, and a wailing wall for draft dodgers. Further, critics called the proposed memorial nothing more than an emotionless list of victims like you would see in a car crash report. And, summed up in this statement by veteran Tom Carhart, this statement actually went on to become a rallying cry for the haters of this monument. But he went on to say, "I don't care about artistic perceptions. I don't care about the rationalizations that abound. One needs no artistic education to see this design for what it is, a black trench that scars them all. Black walls, the universal color of shame and sorrow and degradation, hidden in a hole in the ground with no means of access for those Vietnam veterans who are confined to spend the rest of their days in a wheelchair. Perhaps that's an appropriate design for those who would spit on us still. But can America truly mean that we should feel honored by that black pit?" I mean, these are all extremely harsh statements. But with a war that divided a country, I'm sure this was to be expected. I'm also sure that Maya probably expected a lot of detractors. To know how bitter and spiteful the critics would become, I'm sure, though, it still had to shock her. I mean, her intention was not to add to the division of the country or of society, but to help bring some sense to this tragedy. Despite the visceral reaction of the public, it didn't prevent the monument from being constructed. Hate did eventually have an impact on the National Mall site, though. See, with all this negative press that was, out and continued to be fed, there was a certain amount of appeasement that happened. So what happened is this. The committee who decided on Maya Lin's entry, they actually took the person that came in second, an artist, Frederick Hart. He created a more traditional sculpture. I believe it was like three soldiers in uniform. And that was placed near the Maya's monument as well. Now, Maya believed that this new monument would negate the vision that she held for the site. Now, regardless of her thoughts, both monuments were placed on the grounds provided, and the Commission of Fine Arts, who had the final say, they basically vetoed Maya's outcry. Now, the controversy with this memorial continued throughout the construction of the project. And it was weird because at the same time, these veterans where this memorial was being erected to, they were still outcasts in society. They still suffered under these same silence and mental problems that they had. But interestingly enough, a shift was happening. See, in 1982, a march of Vietnam veterans gathered in Washington, D.C., and they were there for the dedication of this memorial. And in the middle of this monument, emotions started to come to the surface. There was a release of anger as the veterans bonded around Maya's vision. The negativity was immediately replaced by camaraderie and unification, and the brotherhood felt that they could reach out and touch the names of the soldiers of the fallen. The veterans could interact with the memorial in a very intimate way. The monument itself, It impressed upon the crowd, who became somber and reflective, which, if we go back to what the goal of the monument was, perfectly nailed it. Now, the controversy of this memorial, it never went away, and I doubt it ever will. It was a very divisive time. But the main force of that anger and hatred dissipated from the monument and from Maya. I mean, we can look back now and we realize that this monument has become one of the most revered works in America. Maya's vision and connection to the truth behind the conflict was able to take the hate, and it was able to shape the narrative away from the embarrassment and shame to one of honor and sacrifice. And despite all the negativity, it has allowed those impacted by the war to heal to some degree. I would think that that's a success, in spite of the hate. So now in this episode, we did see the impact of hate, some of it self-generated, like with Hemingway, and some of it a byproduct of the artistic process, like Maya's work. But hate held weight with these artists. In Earnest's case, we know his talent will never be diminished, in spite of his reprehensible behavior. There is something timeless in his works that compels readers to, with one hand, elevate him, and with the other, detest him. But let's be clear, it was his own self-hatred that brought the once mighty lion hunter to his knees. In Maya, we see an artist who, despite being the target of a divided nation, and despite the anger of a war many felt was unjust, despite the initial retaliation of the veterans who were lucky enough to return home to a society who dismissed their presence, she held true to the core belief that her memorial was the truth. She created a monument to the fallen that turned hate into healing for so many. And she will always be seen as someone who raised the narrative of the veterans' plight off of its knees. So, as an artist who may be facing hate, or will eventually face hate, you may be asking what can be done to cope with this base emotion. What can the artist do in the face of ignorance and misdirected anger? What about the countless trolls who wait for the artist to show a hairline crack in their image so they can tear it open and create a wound that is permanently on display? Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but I don't have an answer that will help you make sense of it. There is no sense to the mindlessness of the act. But I can tell you this from experience. Hate is never ending, so you have one of two choices. One, you can allow the hate to flow through you and your work without resistance. You could be a lightning rod who takes the full force of negative electricity like a bolt that would undoubtedly set others just ablaze. And you can allow that bolt to disperse through you and out into harmlessness. Or you could allow the hate to halt your progress and burn through your talent and your spirit, leaving only a blackened husk behind. It's your choice. It always is your choice. Remember that. It is you who determines how hate enters and exits your life. No one, no matter the words, no matter the methods that they use to deliver them, can change that. Art survives hate. We've seen so many examples of artists thriving through the hate that they experience. Okay, that's all for this episode. As always, I hope I provided you some food for thought. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe or leave a comment or a rating if you haven't already. Now, this will allow me to get better visibility and hopefully reach other artists. So, thank you in advance if you've done that. If you haven't, please do so. So now, as I always say, stop listening to me and go love your haters.